Honoria Fenwick stood in the doorway of a house that was no longer hers and watched two strange men carry her mother's piano into the street. It was rosewood. Her mother had played it every evening of Honoria's childhood in the long room that faced the river, while the light went gold and then grey over the water. Now the auctioneer's men had it tipped on its side on a hand barrow, and one of them had his thumb pressed flat against the keys so they would not sound. The other was swearing at the weight of it. In her right glove, folded small and warm against her palm, Honoria carried 3 £10 notes. £30. It was everything she owned in the world. She did not weep. She had promised herself that much. Whatever else they took, they would not have her weeping in the street for the neighbours to pass around like a dish of sweets. Down at the coffee house on the Exchange, a man named Silas Crane was already laughing about her. Crane had been her father's chief creditor. He owned the Crane and Blythe coastwise freight house, and he owned, one way or another, near every keel that moved on that stretch of river. Before 40 merchants gathered at their morning cups, he lifted his voice so the whole room could enjoy it. £30, he said. £30, and she thinks herself still a Fenwick. Buy the rotten Marsh End Wharf then, girl, cheapest funeral in Lincolnshire. And the room laughed with him, because it is easy to laugh with the man who holds your debts. That night, cold and out of candles, sheltering in the dripping little office of the condemned Wharf she had bought out of pure spite, Honoria pried up a warped floorboard and found a tin box. Inside was a sealed parchment no living man had read in 90 years, and beside it a tarnished square of brass, heavy as a stone, dark with age. She held it to what light there was. She could not read the crabbed old court hand. Not yet. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this find you where you are, take a moment and subscribe so the next one comes to you when it's ready. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? I like to know who's out there in the dark, listening now. Let me take you back to the beginning and tell it properly. Honoria Fenwick was born to a name that meant ships. For 3 generations the Fenwicks had run honest freight out of Saltney on the tidal reach of a small brown Lincolnshire river that emptied itself into the sea a dozen miles down. Her grandfather had started with one flat-bottomed barge and a good reputation. Her father had grown it to a counting house and a warehouse and a string of vessels, and he had done it the slow way, the way that lets a man look every other man in the eye. A Fenwick bill was as good as coin along that coast. When old sailors said the name they touched their caps, half of them not knowing why anymore, only that it was a thing you did. Her father's one great fault was that he trusted a friend. The friend was not Silas Crane, though Crane was in it soon enough. The friend was a shipowner up the coast who came to Marcus Fenwick one winter in real trouble, and Marcus, being the man he was, put his own name behind the other man's debts. He signed a guarantee. He thought it a small thing between honest men. And the friend went to the bottom, ship and cargo and reputation all at once off a lee shore in a February gale, and the debt did not go down with him. The debt floated, and it floated straight to Marcus Fenwick's door. The paper Marcus had signed passed, by ways he never fully understood, into the hands of Silas Crane. Crane had been buying up the river's paper for years, quietly, the way a patient man buys up a card table 1 seat at a time. When Marcus Fenwick's guarantee came due, it was Crane who held it. And Crane did not want money. Crane wanted the Fenwick trade and the Fenwick landings, and above all he wanted the Fenwick name gone off the water. Because a name that men trust is the one thing a man like Crane can never simply buy. It broke Marcus. Not all at once. It broke him the slow way, over 2 hard years, as one asset after another was signed away to hold the creditors off, and the counting house grew quiet, and the good clerks found other places. Honoria watched it happen from the inside. She was no fool, and her father, who had no son, had never troubled to keep the ledgers a mystery from her. She knew to the shilling what they owed. She sat up with him the last nights, when his heart was failing him plainly, and he would not send for the doctor, because the doctor cost money that was owed elsewhere. "Pay them," he told her near the end. His hand on hers was all bone. "Whatever's left when I'm gone, pay them to the penny. Honoria. I'll not have it said a Fenwick died owing a man an honest shilling. Let them take the roof. Let them take the plate. But the name comes out clean. Promise me." She promised him, and she kept it. When they buried Marcus Fenwick, Honoria sold everything. She sold the house on the river and the furniture in it. She sold her mother's plate and her own few jewels and the good horses and the trap and the very carpets off the floors. She sold it all, and she did not hold a single fine thing back for herself, though the law and every friend she had left told her she was a fool for it. She paid every creditor to the penny, exactly as she had sworn. Every one but the last, and the last was Silas Crane. Crane's was a different sort of debt. Crane's was the great one, the guarantee, and it was so large that the whole estate could not have cleared it, even if she'd kept the plate and sold herself besides. There was a note of it now, drawn up cold and legal, £1,180, and it fell due at Michaelmas. 41 days away, that autumn, when this story truly begins. £1,180, and Honoria Fenwick had 30. So when the last auction was done, and the last barrow rolled away with the last of her family's life on it, she stood in the emptied doorway of the house where she was born, holding £30 in her glove, and she was, for the first time in her life, entirely free. Free the way a leaf is free of the branch. Nothing left to lose is its own strange kind of liberty, and she felt it settle over her that grey afternoon like the first cold of the coming winter. She had nowhere to sleep that night. That was the plain truth of it, under all the fine feeling. The inn wanted coin she meant to make last, and the 2 or 3 families who might once have taken her in had learned, the way people do, to be busy when a ruined woman comes to the door. She had her 3 trunks, clothes, her father's ledgers, a Bible, a few small things the auction had passed over as worthless, and she had the river. It was down at the water's edge, in the last of the light, that she met Daniel Reeve. He was a lighterman. He worked the river for himself, one broad flat lighter and his own 2 hands, ferrying cargo from the deep water moorings up to the wharves and back, honest work in a trade that Silas Crane was slowly squeezing to death. He was perhaps 30, brown from the water, with a quiet way about him and hands that had never in their life been idle. He was making his boat fast for the night when Honoria came down the stone stairs with the first of her trunks on her own shoulder, staggering under it because she had no man left to carry anything and would not have known how to ask. He watched her a moment. Then he came up the stairs without a word and took the trunk from her. "Where's it going, miss?" he asked. "And here is a small thing, but I want you to hold on to it because it matters more than it looks." Daniel Reeve did not know who she was. To him she was only a tired woman in a good coat gone shabby at the cuffs, hauling her own trunk down to the water at dusk. He did not know she was gentry, or that she'd been a Fenwick, or that half the town was chewing over her downfall that very hour in the coffee-house. He only saw a person carrying more than one person ought to carry, and he set down his own work to help. Remember that. It comes to matter, later, more than either of them could have guessed. "I hardly know," she said honestly. "Down the reach. I have a place. Of a sort." She had a place. That morning, before the auction, in a small hot fury she was not proud of, she had taken part of her £30. A great part of it, near all, and she had bought the one thing Silas Crane had told her to buy. She had walked into the harbour clerk's office with the laughter still ringing in the town, and she had bought the condemned Wharf at Marsh End, down the reach, a rotting timber landing and a leaning office that no one had used in a lifetime. It cost almost nothing, because it was worth almost nothing. It was, the clerk told her plainly, not fit to stand on. But it had a deed, and the deed, when they wrote it out, had her name on it. Fenwick, the only roof left in the world with her name on it, even if the roof leaked and the whole of it was falling into the tide. Marsh End, she told Reeve. The old Wharf. He looked at her then, a longer look, and she braced for the pity or the amusement. It did not come. He only nodded slowly, as a man does when he has decided something. "That's a fair pull down the reach in the dark," he said. "Trunks and all. You'll not manage it up the towpath, not 3 of them, not tonight." He was already turning back toward his lighter. "Bring them down. I'll take you. I can pay you," she said quickly, her hand going to the notes in her glove. "I can a little. Bring them down," was all he said. He rowed her 3 trunks down the darkening reach for nothing. She offered twice more, and twice more he would not hear it, and at last she understood that offering again would insult him, so she stopped, and sat in the stern of his broad, quiet boat, and watched the black water slide by, and the reeds, and the first stars coming out cold and clear over the marsh. He worked the sweeps without hurry. Neither of them spoke much. There was no need. Once, when the current took them wrong at a bend, he leaned into it easy and set them straight, and she saw how the whole river was known to him, every eddy and shoal of it, the way a man knows the yard behind his own house. "You know the reach well," she said. "Born on it," he said. "My father before me." A pause, the water dripping off the sweeps. "It's a good river." Or it was. "There's a man's got his hand round its throat now." He did not say the name. He did not have to. On that river, that autumn, there was only one man it could be. He put her ashore at Marsh End near midnight, and he carried all 3 trunks up the broken landing to the door of the leaning office himself, and he tried the door and found it would open, and he looked at the state of the place in the light of the one lantern he carried, the sagging roof, the black wet timbers, the smell of rot and river coming up through the boards, and something in his face tightened. But he did not tell her not to stay. He understood, perhaps, that she had nowhere else, and that saying so out loud would only take from her the last thing she had, which was her composure. "There'll be dry corners," he said instead. "There always are. Keep your back to the landward wall, the weather comes off the water." He set the lantern down on the trunk and looked at her. "I'm up and down the reach most days." "Reeve. Daniel Reeve. You've a name?" She hesitated. And then, because she had promised her father she would carry it clean and she would not begin hiding it now, she said Fenwick, Honoria Fenwick. She watched it land. She watched him understand the name and the auction and all of it sliding into place behind his eyes. And she waited for whatever came next, the pity or the awkwardness or the small cruelty of a man learning he'd done a favour for someone above his station. But Daniel Reeve only nodded once, slowly, as though a thing that had puzzled him was now explained, and he touched the brim of his cap the old way the old sailors used to for her grandfather, and he said, "Then it's an honour. Miss Fenwick, good night." And he went down to his boat and pushed off into the dark, and she stood alone in the doorway of her rotting wharf and, for reasons she could not have told you, found her eyes stinging at last, not at the ruin, but at the touched cap. She did not weep even then. But it was a near thing. The wharf was not, in fact, entirely deserted. She learned this the next morning, when she woke stiff and cold on a nest of her own gowns in the driest corner of the office to the sound of a broom. An old man was sweeping the landing. He was 70 if he was a day, thin and bent as a shepherd's crook, with white hair that stood up in tufts, and he was sweeping the rotten planks of a wharf that no ship had touched in a lifetime, sweeping them slow and careful, as if the king himself were expected before noon. He wore a coat that had been mended so many times it was more mend than coat. When she came out into the raw grey light he stopped, and leaned on his broom and looked at her without much surprise, as though ruined heiresses turned up on his landing most weeks. "You'd be the new owner then," he said. "They told me it sold." didn't say who to. He looked her up and down, not unkindly. "Fenwick, is it? I can see the old master in you. About the mouth. You knew my grandfather?" "Knew him. Worked for him, near the end of it, before the trade left this landing." He set the broom against the wall. "Tobias Merritt. Clerk of Marsh End Wharf, man and boy, 60 year." He said it with a strange, worn dignity, this old man clerk of a landing where nothing had landed in his lifetime. "There's none pays me for it now, mind. Been none to pay me 30 year. But it's the Wharf's, so I keep it. Somebody ought." He picked up the broom again. "You'll be wanting it swept as well, I dare say, now it's yours." She had almost nothing. She could not pay him a farthing. She told him so plainly. And Tobias Merritt only nodded, as if that too were about what he'd expected, and went on sweeping, and stayed. He had nowhere better to be, and neither now did she, and so the two of them kept that condemned landing together, the ruined young woman and the ancient unpaid clerk, and it was, God help her, the nearest thing to a household she had left. It was Tobias who saved the papers. It came on to be bitter that first week, an early cold snap out of the north, with a wind that came straight off the marsh and found every gap in the rotten timbers, and there were nights it. There was a little iron stove in the office, rusted but sound, and she had a small store of driftwood and broken crate, but it was never enough, and she had used the last of her candle ends, and one raw evening, near frozen and half-blind in the dark, she went hunting through the office for anything dry that would burn. She found a drawer full of old papers. They were in the big desk that took up half the little office, a drawer stuffed with dockets and dusty parchments, and ledger leaves gone soft with the damp. All of it, to her eye, so much old rubbish, the leavings of a dead trade. 90 years of it, maybe. She gathered a great armful of the driest, meaning to feed it to the stove and get 1 hour of warmth before she slept, and she had the first sheaf of it in her hand and the stove door open and the little flame reaching for it, when Tobias Merritt's hand closed round her wrist. He moved quicker than an old man ought. "Not those, miss," he said. "Those are the Wharf's." And he took the papers out of her hand, gentle but sure, and put them back in the drawer, and shut it, and stood in front of it. "Burn crate. Burn the broken pallet. There's a stack of it under the landing. But not the Wharf's papers. A Wharf's papers is a Wharf's papers. My father'd have skinned me." And he would say no more about it, only fetched her an armful of old pallet wood from under the landing and got her fire going, and she was too cold and too tired to argue with a mad old man over a drawer of mouldering dockets. She barely marked it. It was the smallest thing in the world. It was later that same night, hunting under the loose floorboard for a dropped coin, that she found the tin box, and the sealed parchment inside it, and the heavy square of tarnished brass. She held the parchment to the firelight. The ink was brown with age, and the hand was the old court hand, all long looping tales and letters, made like nothing anyone wrote now, and she, who read 3 languages, could not make out 1 line of it in 10. She saw a date, or thought she did. She saw what might have been a crown drawn small at the head of it, and she saw where a seal had once hung a frayed silk cord, and the seal itself gone. She set it aside. She was too cold and too weary that night for old puzzles, and she thought it only some ancient bill of sale, some dead man's business 90 years done. She put it back in its tin box for safekeeping, out of the wharf clerk's odd reverence for the Wharf's papers, and she slept. She could not have known she was sleeping beside the thing that would remake her whole life. Silas Crane came for her on the 8th day. He came in style, which was his way. He came down the reach in his own smart gig of a boat with 2 men at the oars, and he was dressed like the wealth he was, a heavy coat and a gold watch chain across a broad, hard belly. And he had timed it, of course, for he did nothing by accident. He timed it for the 1 hour of the week when Marsh End was not quite deserted. A small merchant's hoy had put in that morning further up the reach, and there were men about on the water, and Daniel Reeves' lighter was working a load nearby, and 3 or 4 of the small watermen who scraped a living on that river were within earshot, taking their bread and cheese on the bank. Crane wanted an audience. Crane always wanted an audience. A cruelty done in private is only spent. A cruelty done before witnesses earns interest. He stepped up onto her rotten landing without asking leave, and looked about him at the ruin of it with open enjoyment, and then he looked at Honoria, standing in the office door in her mended gown, with the old clerk behind her, and he smiled the way a cat smiles. "Miss Fenwick," he said, "you look well." Considering, he let that sit. "I've come to do you a kindness. Against my own interest, mind and my partner's will say I'm a soft fool, but there it is. I knew your father." He said it as a man might mention he had once owned a horse. "This place is a death trap. It'll come down on your head one winter night and drown you in the tide, and I'll not have it on my conscience." So he drew out a folded paper and held it up, careless, between 2 fingers. "Sign the Wharf back to me. I'll give you £15 for it. £15 cash in your hand today. More than it's worth by £14, and you know it, and you'll walk away with something instead of a wet grave." He glanced round at the watermen on the bank, drawing them in, sharing the joke. "It's charity, is what it is." She said nothing at first. She looked at the £15 it would put in her hand, and she thought, honestly, of what £15 would mean. A roof somewhere dry, a month or 2 of not being cold. It would have been so easy. "No," she said. Crane's smile did not move, but something behind it did. "No," he repeated. "The Wharf's not for sale, Mr. Crane. Not to you. Not to me." He laughed then, short and hard, and turned to the watermen on the bank so they would not miss a word. "You hear her? Not to me. The girl's £30 from the workhouse, and she'll not sell a rotting jetty to the one man daft enough to buy it." He turned back, and now the amusement had a blade in it. "I'll tell you what you've bought, Miss Fenwick, since no one else will be honest with you. You've bought a joke. You've bought the thing this whole river's been laughing at for a week. £30 for a rotting jetty, cheapest funeral in Lincolnshire." He let the men on the bank laugh. Some of them did, uneasily. "I'll not offer twice. When it comes down, and it will, don't send to me. Sit in the workhouse and think on the day Silas Crane offered you £15 and your pride told you no." He folded his paper away. He had what he came for, which was to do the thing in front of witnesses, to set the whole river laughing at her one more time. To make her refusal look like the mad pride of a beaten woman rather than the one clean thing she had left. He stepped back down into his boat. "Good day, Miss Fenwick," he said, tipping his hat with heavy mockery. "Mind the tide." And they rowed him away up the reach, and behind him he left her standing on her broken landing, publicly and completely alone, one ruined woman against the man who held her river and her debt and her father's name, with 41 days shrunk now to 33 before Michaelmas came, and £1,180 fell due that she could no more pay than she could pay the moon. The watermen on the bank went quiet and would not meet her eye, the way men do when they have half laughed at a thing they are ashamed of. Only Daniel Reeve, out on the water, had not laughed at all. He had shipped his sweeps and sat still through the whole of it, watching, and when Crane's boat had gone, he brought his lighter in to her landing and made it fast, and came up, and he did not offer her comfort, which she could not have borne, but only said, "Lo, you were right to tell him no." And then, after a moment, looking out at the grey reach, "He's afraid of this Wharf. I've thought so a while. A man doesn't come all this way to laugh at a thing that's nothing to him," and he went back to his work and left her that small, strange sentence to turn over, which she did. That night, by the stove, why should Silas Crane be afraid of a Wharf? That was the question that made her go back to the old man and the drawer. She waited 2 more days, because pride is a slow thing to bend, and because she did not truly believe it would come to anything. But Reeve's words would not leave her. A man doesn't come all this way to laugh at a thing that's nothing to him. And on the 10th night she took the tin box down off the shelf where she'd kept it, and she brought it to the stove where old Tobias sat mending a net that no one would ever fish, and she put the sealed parchment in his hands, and she asked him plainly whether he, who had been clerk here 60 years, could read the old court hand. The old man's eyes changed when he saw it. He held it a long moment before he spoke. He carried it close to the lamp, and his lips moved, and his crooked finger went along the lines slow, slow, and Honoria watched his face and saw something come into it that she had not seen there before, a kind of trembling wakefulness, as if a thing he had half remembered all his life were rising up whole in front of him at last. "I knew it was here," he whispered. "My father said it. He said, 'Boy, so long as this paper's under this roof, this landing's worth more than all Crane's fleet, though not a soul remember it.' I thought he'd gone soft. He was old. His hand was shaking. 'Lord, Lord, it's this. It's the very this.' 'Read it to me,' Honoria said. "'Tobias, what is it?' And by the light of one lamp, in the leaning office of a wharf the whole town called a joke, the old clerk read it out. It was a charter. A Crown Harbour Charter, granted in the year 1698, under the hand and seal of the Crown, to the wharf and landing of Marsh End, and to its owner in perpetuity. 90 years and more it had lain in that drawer, and what it granted, in the long looping words of a dead age, was this: the sole and only lawful right of landing along 4 full miles of the tidal reach, between 2 named marks on the water, the Saltney Bar at the upper end and the old sea mark at the lower. Every cargo of every ship that touched the shore of that reach, by law and by the Crown's own grant, owed a landing due to the owner of Marsh End Wharf. Every keel, every hundredweight put ashore between those 2 marks. It had never been revoked, it had never been sold, it had only been forgotten. Tobias's voice cracked on the last of it, and he lowered the parchment, and in the lamplight the tears stood in the old man's eyes. 4 mile of the reach, he said. "Miss, do you know what lands on 4 mile of this reach? Every load that comes up to Saltney lands on it. Every load Crane brings up. Every keel in this river touches that water somewhere between the bar and the sea mark. There's no way up nor down that doesn't." He gripped her wrist as he had that first cold night. "It all owes here. By the Crown's own hand, it all owes here. It owes you." Honoria sat very still. The stove ticked. Out beyond the thin wall the tide was making, she could hear it, the small ceaseless work of the water against the timbers of the wharf that was hers. She reached into the tin box, and she took out the heavy square of tarnished brass, and she turned it to the light, and now she saw it for what it was. Not a paperweight, not old rubbish, but a seal. A stamp. She saw the crown cut into the dark metal, and the letters round it, and the 2 marks, and she understood that this was the very thing that had been meant to hang from the frayed silk cord on the parchment, the dues stamp, the thing that made a landing ticket lawful. And on the wall above the desk, where she had thought some clerk had once idly scored the plaster, she saw now the long columns of tally marks going up toward the ceiling, hundreds upon hundreds of them, and she understood those too. 90 years of dues. 90 years of what was owed to this landing, and never, since the day the paper slipped behind the floorboard, once collected. "Why?" she said softly. "If it's true, if it was all this time true, why did the trade leave? Why is the wharf condemned? Why did no one ever?" But Tobias had no answer for her, only shook his white head, and that question hung in the smoky air, unanswered. And I will tell you now that it is the most important question in this whole story, and that its answer, when it comes, will bring the great Silas Crane down into the mud, but that is a good way off yet, and she did not know to ask it right, and neither, yet, do you. That night she did not sleep at all. She sat up with the charter and the seal, reading and rereading the lines Tobias had made plain to her, checking them against her father's ledgers, against the harbour maps, against everything she knew of that river. And every way she turned it, it held. It was real. It was live. It had never been undone. She was on a rotting landing that had cost her nearly her last penny, the lawful holder of a right that reached out over 4 miles of water and touched every ship that moved. She did not gloat. That was not in her. She thought of her father and his one great fault, which was that he had trusted a friend, and his one great virtue, which was that his name had been as good as coin, and she thought that here, perhaps at the very bottom of everything, was a way to keep her promise to him after all. Not the workhouse, not the wet grave Crane had wished on her, but the name kept clean and standing, on paper, under the Crown's own hand. But knowing a thing and proving a thing are 2 different matters, and she was wise enough even that first night to know it. A 90-year-old parchment read out by an old clerk was one thing. Making a single ship pay was another. And so, in the days that followed, she waited, and she watched the reach, and she did not go shouting her charter up and down the river, for she had learnt the price of a public scene. She simply waited for the water to bring her the first test. It came, of all things, on a small fishing hoy. It was a fortnight on, a still bright morning with the tide full, and a little single-masted hoy came up the reach with a night's catch aboard, and out of pure old habit, because in his grandfather's day everything landed at Marsh End, the master put her in against Honoria's landing to set his fish ashore for the Saltney market. He was an old fisherman. He knew no better. His father had landed there, and his father's father, and his hands turned the boat in without his head being asked. Honoria stood on the landing and watched the baskets of silver fish come up, and her heart beat so hard she thought the man must hear it. Then she went into the office, and she took down the tin box, and she took out the brass seal, which she had cleaned now, patiently, over 3 evenings, with rag and river sand and a little oil, until the dark tarnish came away, and the crown and the letters stood up bright, and she took a leaf of clean paper, and, in her own steady clerk's hand, she wrote out a landing ticket. So much catch, landed this day at Marsh End Wharf, dues owing 6p the keel, by the Crown Charter of 1698. And she pressed the bright brass seal down onto the wax, hard, and lifted it, and there was the crown, sharp and lawful, the first impression that seal had made in 90 years. Her hands were shaking. She was ashamed of it, but they shook. She walked out onto the landing, and she gave the ticket to the old fisherman, and she told him, quietly, what it was, and what was owed, 6p, by ancient right. The old man looked at the ticket. He looked at the bright seal. He was of an age to have heard, far back, the tag ends of the old stories, and something in him seemed to settle, as a thing settles that has been a little out of true for a long time. And he reached into his pocket, and he put 6p into her hand. 6p, one small silver coin, warm from his pocket. The first lawful landing due paid at Marsh End Wharf in 90 years, paid into the palm of a woman the whole river was still laughing at. She did not gloat. She closed her hand round the coin, and she thanked him, even and calm, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and not the hinge on which her whole life had just turned. She went back into the office. She opened her father's great ledger to a clean page, and under his name, in the old counting-house column, in her fine, steady hand, she wrote the first entry of the new account. 1 keel, landed, dues, 6p, received, the charter worked. Outside, the tide ran on up the reach, as it had for 10,000 years, past the bar and the sea mark, and every keel that moved between them, and not one master on that whole 4 miles of water yet knew what Honoria Fenwick now held in a rusted tin box, or what that single silver 6p in her ledger was about to mean for every ship that dared to touch her shore. She did not keep the 6p in her pocket long. The next morning she took a hammer and 4 nails from Tobias's tool chest, and she took the charter itself, the true parchment, and a clean sheet on which she had copied out, in her fine steady hand, a plain table of the lawful dues. 6p the keel for a fishing hoy, a shilling for a coastwise lighter, more for the heavy freight, the coal and the timber and the bonded goods. Every figure drawn straight from the old court hand, nothing added, nothing softened. She carried them out to the wharf gate. Tobias followed her, saying nothing, his broom forgotten against the wall. Daniel Reeve had come up the reach that hour with a load of withies, and he stood in his lighter and watched her, and he did not speak either. She nailed the charter to the gate, one nail at each corner. Then she nailed the table of dues beside it, where any man coming up off the water could read it. She did not make a speech. She did not shake her fist at the river. She smoothed the parchment flat with her palm once, the way you would smooth a bed, and she stepped back. That was all. The law, made visible, nailed to a gate for the whole reach to read. Behind her, Tobias made a small sound in his throat. When she turned, he was looking at the paper on the gate, as a man looks at something he had given up hope of seeing. 60 years he had swept this landing for nothing. 60 years, and no keel had paid, and no owner had come, and the tally marks had only grown on the office wall, 90 years of dues no man had ever collected. "You've done it, miss," he said. His voice was not steady. "You've hung it up where they can read it. They'll not like the reading," she said. "No," said Tobias. "No, they will not." Daniel Reeve pulled his lighter in against the landing. He looked up at her from the water, and there was something new in his face, something careful and glad at once. "Word of this will be at Saltney by noon," he said. "Then carry it," she said. "Carry it true. Every figure on that gate is lawful. I've not invented a farthing." He looked at the paper a long moment. Then he looked back at her. "They rowed you down here to laugh," he said. "The whole river laughed. I know it. They'll not laugh long." And he pushed off and let the tide take him up toward the town, and he carried the word with him. The word ran up the reach faster than any tide. By that first afternoon the small watermen began to come. Not grandly, not all at once. A man in a leaky punt with a load of eels. A boy sculling a dinghy of oysters up from the flats. They had landed at Marsh End all their lives out of habit, because it was the nearest hard standing to the fishing grounds, and they had never paid a soul, because there had been no soul to pay. Now there was, and here was the thing she had not looked for. They paid gladly. The first of them, the eelman, took the ticket from her hand with the fresh crown stamped bright upon it, and he turned it over, and he said, "Marsh End's alive again then," and he paid his 6p, and he did not grumble, and when she thanked him he shook his head. "You don't know what Crane's been at us," he said. "You don't know, miss, he's had the whole river by the throat these 10 years. A man can't land a basket of fish at Saltney Quay, but Crane's tollman's there with his hand out, and it's Crane's toll, mind, not the board's, Crane's own, and no charter behind it but his fist. 6p to you by an honest paper, I'll pay it and glad. It's the first honest 6p this water's asked of me in a decade." She had not understood, until that moment, quite what she had walked into. Crane had strangled the river, slowly, quietly, over years, buying out the small houses and undercutting the free lightermen and bleeding the watermen with tolls he had no right to charge. And the men of the reach had borne it, because there was nothing to set against him. No paper. No right. No one the proud man had to answer to. And now there was a paper on a gate. That evening Tobias read her the charter again, slowly, and she followed the old hand, now that she had learned its tricks, and she saw the 2 named marks that fixed the 4 miles. The Saltney bar at the upper end, the old sea mark at the lower, every yard of water between them, and every keel that touched shore on it, bound to the landing at Marsh End by the Crown's own seal. Why did it stop? She asked him. 90 years of dues on that wall, unpaid, why did the wharf go idle, and the right go to sleep, and everyone forget? The old man was quiet a while. "There was a bad year," he said at last. "Long before my time. The last Fenwick, but your grandfather died sudden, no heir near, and the Wharf went to lawyers, and the trade drifted up to Saltney where the new quays were. And then he stopped. And then it was just forgotten. Miss, papers get forgotten. A right no one troubles to collect is as good as dead, and folk stop believing in it." He looked at the tin box. But it wasn't dead. It was only sleeping. Nobody had revoked it. Nobody could. It's the Crown's grant, and the Crown never took it back. Someone was glad to see it sleep, she said slowly. Tobias said nothing to that. But his old eyes went to the box, and away again, and she marked it, and set the thought aside for later. She could not know how near the truth she had come. Now a merchant of Saltney, hearing of the paper on the gate and not liking to pay dues to a girl he had watched be ruined, took himself to Mr. Sartard, Alsop, the Harbour Board's own solicitor, and he laid down a fee, and he said, plainly, "Prove this rag a forgery, and rid us of it." Mr. Alsop was a dry man, and a careful one, and he did not care a straw for the girl or for Crane either. He cared for the record. He took the charter, under Honoria's watching eye, and he took it away to the board's muniment room, where the old registers were kept, and he was gone 3 days. Those were long days. On the second of them, Daniel Reeve came up the reach with his face set hard, and he told her what was being said in the town. "Crane's clerks are putting it about that the paper's false," he said, "that you cooked it up. A ruined girl and a mad old sweeper forging a Crown seal in a leaky office to tax honest men. That's the tale. Do they believe it? Some do. Some want to." He hesitated. Crane laughed, they say, when they told him a Fenwick was taxing his river. He laughed in the coffee-house before them all, and he said, Reeve stopped. "Say it." He said, "Let her tax the tide then. I'll pay her the day the sea runs backward." She turned that over, and she found, to her own surprise, that it did not frighten her, because Crane was laughing at a girl, and she was no longer only a girl. She was the owner of a live Crown charter, and she was waiting on a dry solicitor in a muniment room, and Silas Crane did not yet understand that the ground had already moved under him. "Let him laugh," she said. "Mr. Alsop is not laughing." On the third day, Mr. Alsop came down the reach himself in a hired boat, with the charter wrapped in oilcloth on his knee. He came up onto the landing, and he looked about him at the tarred sheds and the tally marks and the plain table of dues nailed to the gate, and he took off his hat to her, which he had not done before. "Miss Fenwick," he said, "I have compared your charter against the board's registers of grants and against the Crown enrolment of harbour rights for this coast." He paused, being a man who weighed his words. "It is not a forgery. It is a true and enrolled instrument of 1698. It has never been revoked, surrendered, nor set aside. It is, in the plain sense of the law, live and binding upon every vessel landing within the 4 miles it names." The silence on the landing was complete. "You mean," she said, very carefully, "that it stands." "I mean, madam, that it has always stood. It merely went uncollected." He looked at her over his spectacles. "That is a different thing from being void. 90 years of neglect does not kill a Crown grant. I have put my opinion in writing, and I have signed it, and I will not be moved from it, because the record will not be moved." He handed her back the oilcloth. "You are owed dues, Miss Fenwick. You have been owed them a long time." She took the charter. Her hands were steady now. "Then I shall collect them," she said. And so came the day the whole river had been walking toward without knowing it. A full Crane and Blythe coastwise cargo came down the reach, a heavy lighter, deep laden with bonded goods, bound to land at the reach and cart up to Saltney by the low road, the way Crane's freight had always come, because it was cheaper than the quay dues at the town. It touched shore within the 4 miles. Honoria went down onto the landing with her ledger and her seal and Tobias at her shoulder, and Mr. Alsop happened to be there still, for he had lingered a day to see the board's business done, and behind them, drawn by the word that ran everywhere now, came boats, small boats, watermen and fishers and idlers, and up on the low road a knot of Saltney merchants who had ridden out to see the sport, the very men who had laughed in the coffee-house. The lighter's master was a crane man, and he knew nothing yet, and he made his craft fast at Marsh End as his house had always done. Honoria met him at the head of the landing. "You've landed within the 4-mile reach," she said. "Landing dues are owing to this wharf, by Crown Charter. I'll write your ticket." The man laughed in her face. He was not unkind about it, only certain. "Dues? To you, missus? Crane and Blythe don't pay dues to a jetty. We land where we please. Always have. Not on this water," she said. "Mr. Alsop?" And the dry solicitor stepped forward, before the merchants, before the watermen, before the crowd on the bank, and he spoke so all could hear. "The charter is genuine. I have examined it against the Crown enrolment, and I have certified it in writing. This wharf holds sole lawful landing rights over 4 miles of this reach, from the Saltney Bar to the old sea mark. Every keel that touches shore between those marks owes landing dues to Miss Fenwick, and that includes the house of Crane and Blythe. The law is not in doubt. The dues are owing. You could hear the tide, and nothing else." Then Honoria said the words the whole reach would carry to Saltney and beyond, and she said them without heat, which was worse than heat. "Every keel that touches this reach touches my landing. Read the charter, Mr. Crane." She stamped the ticket, the Crown biting sharp into the wax. "Then pay the dues." Crane's own fleet was the first to owe. The lighterman went white and then red. He did not pay that day, for he had no orders to, and he cast off and went up to the town at speed to carry the thing to his master. But the ticket was written, and the debt was entered in the ledger under Marcus Fenwick's name, and Mr. Alsop had spoken it before witnesses, and the merchants on the low road were not laughing now. They were watching a girl they had buried in a joke, and they were beginning, some of them, to be afraid. The title's whole promise had landed, in the open, before the very men who mocked her. But Silas Crane did not fall in a day. He was a hard man, and a clever one, and when the ground moves under a clever man, he does not stand still to be swallowed. He struck back, and he struck along 2 lines at once, and both of them near cost her everything. The first was his name. He went into the coffee-house at Saltney before the 40 merchants, and he staked his whole reputation on a single word. Forgery. The charter was a forgery, he said, cooked up by a bankrupt girl and a senile clerk to bleed honest trade. He, Silas Crane, would prove it false, and he would see the pair of them in the dock for it, and he pledged his name and his fortune on the outcome. He said it loud, and he said it certain, and men who did not want to pay dues were glad to believe him. And the thing about a lie told loud by a rich man is that it does not have to be true to do harm. It only has to be believed long enough. If the town held to Crane's word, and Michaelmas came, and her father's note fell due, the £1,180 Crane held against the Fenwick name would ruin her past all mending, forgery or no forgery, charter or no charter. 41 days had become fewer than a dozen. The clock was running against her, and Crane knew it, and he meant to run out the clock and break her before the law could vindicate her. That was the first line. The second came at night, and it did not wear a lawyer's face. On the 10th night after the charter was nailed to the gate, 3 men came down the reach in a muffled boat with the oars greased to run silent, and they came for the tin box. They knew, plainly, that the paper was the girl's whole strength, and that without the true parchment in her hand no certificate of Alsop's would save her. For the original was the thing, the enrolled instrument, the object itself. Burn the box, and the charter was smoke, and a girl's word against Silas Crane's was no contest at all. They had not reckoned on Tobias Merritt. The old man had taken to sleeping in the office, on a pallet by the iron stove, with the tin box under his hand. 71 years old, and he slept across the drawer of the Wharf's papers like a dog across a doorway. He heard the boat. He heard a boot on the landing. And he was up, and he had the box against his chest, before the first man got the door. They were not gentle with him. She heard it from the loft where she slept, the crash and the old man's cry, and she came down the ladder with the office poker in her hand and no thought in her head but the box and the old man, and she was screaming for Daniel Reeve, who slept his lighter 3 reaches down, screaming loud enough to wake the water. And the water woke. Reeve was not the only free waterman on the reach who had come to bless the paper on the gate. A lamp went up. Then another. A voice called across the dark, and the 3 men in the office found, of a sudden, that the whole reach was rousing, that lights were moving on the water, that whatever they had come to do quietly could not now be done quietly at all. They dropped the old man. One of them tried for the box in his arms and could not get it loose, for Tobias would not let go, would not. His old hands locked round it, though the breath was half beat out of him. And then Daniel Reeve came through the door. They ran. They went out the back and over the mud and into their boat and away into the dark, and they left Tobias Merritt on the office floor with the tin box still crushed to his chest and the blood on his mouth and the charter safe inside. She got down beside him. She got his old head up onto her knee. "I held it, miss," he said. He could barely speak. "I held the Wharf's papers. 60 years I swept this landing. I held them. You held them, Tobias. You held them. Be still now. Be still." He was hurt, but he was not broken. A cracked rib and his face bruised black, and a shake in his old hands for a week after that never quite left them. But he lived, and the box lived. And Silas Crane had shown his hand at last, in the dark, with hired men, and that too would tell against him before the end, for the Reach had seen it, and the Reach did not forget. But it was in the chasing down of that night's work that the last hidden thing came to light, the thing that closed the oldest question of all. For Mr. Alsop, hearing of the raid, and being now fully engaged in the matter, went deeper into the board's old registers than any man had gone in 90 years. He was looking to see who might have wanted the charter dead. And he found it. He found the record of a petition, 60 years gone, from a young freight house on the rise, praying the board to treat the Marsh End rights as lapsed and the 4-mile reach as open water, free to all landing. The freight house was Crane and Blythe, Crane's own grandfather, Crane's own house. They had known of the charter. They had known it was live, and rather than pay the dues they owed to Marsh End, or buy the right honestly, they had gone quietly to the board and had the whole thing treated as dead, and buried the paper's memory, and built their fortune on the 4 miles of water they had no lawful right to hold. 90 years of dues on that office wall, unpaid, and every farthing of them owed, in the end, by the house of Crane, who had smothered the charter to steal the trade. His fortune was built on the very dues he had never paid. That was why Silas Crane had feared the Wharf. That was why he had come himself, with £15 that day on the quay, to buy her out and be rid of Marsh End quiet and cheap. Not because the jetty was worth having. Because a jetty came with a paper, and the paper was a knife at the throat of everything his family had stolen. He had not been laughing at a rotting wharf. He had been trying all along to bury the one thing that could ruin him before some fool troubled to read it. And a girl he had buried in a joke had gone and read it aloud. The hearing was set for Michaelmas itself. The Harbour Board convened it, and because the sum and the right were great, an Admiralty registrar came down from London to sit on it, a man whose whole office was the truth of Crown seals. And because Crane had made his accusation in public, the hearing was held in public, at the Wharf Gate, at Marsh End, with the charter nailed above their heads and the tide running below. They all came. The Harbour Board, in a row of hired chairs. The Admiralty registrar, grey and exact, with the Crown's own register of seals open on the table before him, Mr. Alsop, dry and immovable, his certificate in his hand. Daniel Reeve at the water's edge, with the free watermen of the reach behind him, a whole silent fleet of small boats. Tobias Merritt mended enough to stand, his face still marked, the tin box in his 2 hands. And the 40 merchants who had laughed. They came too. They stood in a knot by the gate, in their good coats, and they were not laughing. And Silas Crane came last, and stood apart, and staked his name on forgery to the end. The registrar did not hurry. He was not a man who could be hurried. He took the brass seal from Honoria's hand, the tarnished square of brass that had lain 90 years in a tin box, that she had polished to stamp a fisherman's sixpence, and he turned it in the light. Then he took a fresh cake of wax, and he pressed the seal into it himself, with his own hand, and he laid the new impression beside the Crown's register impression of 1698, the master record kept in London, brought down for this one purpose. He bent over the 2 of them a long time. The whole reach held its breath. The tide itself seemed to wait. "They match," said the registrar. He said it flatly, as a fact, which was the most terrible way he could have said it. Line for line. This is the seal named in the enrolment. There is no question of it. This is the true dues stamp of the Marsh End Charter, and no copy nor forgery could answer to the register as this does. It is genuine. He straightened up. The charter is genuine, he said. It is live. It is binding upon every keel that lands within the 4 miles, without exception, and that includes the house of Crane and Blythe. Back dues are owing from every vessel that has landed unlawfully within the reach, for so long as the record can be made to show. He looked at Mr. Alsop, and the record, I am told, shows a great deal. Mr. Alsop stepped forward and read his ruling aloud, in his dry, careful voice, and every word of it fell on the merchants like a stone into still water. Genuine, live, binding, back dues owed. And then the older thing, the buried petition, the Crane House's own hand in smothering the right 60 years gone, read out plain before them all, so that every man there understood at last what Silas Crane had really done, and why. The merchants who had laughed stood silent under it, and here was the sweetness of it, the thing that made the whole long injustice come right. She had not schemed for any of it. She had laid no trap. She had told no lie. She had cheated no man of a farthing. She had only picked up a paper the proud were too proud to read it, and nailed it to a gate. The law had done the rest. She had wielded nothing but the truth. And the truth had been enough. When the ruling was done, there was a silence. And then the merchants began to come to the gate. One by one. The first was a stout man in a plum coat who had laughed loudest of all in the coffee house. He came up to the gate, and he could not, at first, get the words out. Then he said, "Miss Fenwick, I landed goods on this reach a fortnight since. I'll pay what's owing. And I'll say—" He stopped, and worked his jaw, and got it out. "I'll say I'm sorry for my part in the coffee house. It was ill done. Your father was an honest man, and I knew it, and I laughed at his daughter, and it was ill done. And he paid his ticket, and he went. The second could not meet her eye at all. He put his money down on the ledger and mumbled something and was gone almost before she could stamp his ticket, his face burning, and she let him go, and said nothing to shame him, for there was no need. The third came slowly, an older merchant, and he stood a moment looking at the paper on the gate, and at the small boats on the water, and at the seal in her hand. "You've set the dues low," he said. "I looked at the table. You could have had double, by that charter, and no man could gainsay you." "Why low?" "Because I know what it is to be bled," she said. "I'll not do to this river what Crane did. The dues are low, and they're public, and they're the same for a fishing hoy as for a rich man's freight. By the keel. Fair, no man on this reach will be ruined by my gate. He'll only be dealt with honest." The old merchant looked at her a long moment, "Then I'd sooner trade honest through your landing than crooked through cranes," he said. "There's many of us would. You'll have our freight, Miss Fenwick, and glad of it if you'll deal square." "I'll deal square," she said. That's the whole of it. That's all it ever was. And in the same hour, at the same gate, the good waterman prospered. Daniel Reeves' lighter was hired that day by 3 of the merchants who had come to pay honest work at an honest rate, for the first time in 10 years free of Crane's tollman and Crane's fist. The small men of the Reach, who had been bled a decade, came and paid their 6pence gladly and went away richer for the fairness of it, because a fare due openly charged is cheaper by far than a robber's toll. The arrogant paid and were humbled, and the honest worked and were lifted in the one scene, at the one gate, on the one tide. And then there was Crane. He had stood apart through all of it, and he had gone from red to grey as the registrar spoke, and greyer as Alsop read out his grandfather's buried petition before the whole town. He had staked his name on forgery. He had pledged his fortune on it in the coffee-house before 40 men, and the seal had matched the register line for line, and the charter was genuine, and his name was now staked to a lie that all the world had watched come apart. The board's order was plain. Crane and Blythe owed the back dues, all of them, 90 years of unlawful landing on 4 miles of water, every keel his house had run down that reach since his grandfather buried the right. Mr. Alsop had the figures, and the figures were vast, so vast that the £1,180 Crane held against her father's name was a small thing beside them, a pebble beside a mountain. The board set his debt to the landing against his note upon the Fenwicks, and the note was swallowed whole, cancelled, gone, and still he owed more than the note, owed more than he could easily find, and his grip on the river, the whole strangling monopoly, was struck out of his hand in an afternoon, for it had never been lawful, and now every man on the water knew it. He came to the gate last of all, because he had to. A cargo of his was on the Reach that very day, and by the board's order it must be ticketed and the due paid, here, now, before them all, before it could be moved. He came up to the gate where the girl stood with her ledger and her seal. He did not speak. There was nothing left for him to say that would not make it worse. His face was the face of a man watching the ground he had stood on all his life turn to water beneath him. Honoria did not gloat. She had promised herself she would not. And she did not. She took his cargo's particulars. She wrote the ticket in her fine, steady hand. She pressed the brass seal down into the wax, the crown sharp and lawful, the same seal his grandfather had schemed to bury, and she lifted it, and she slid the ticket across the ledger to him. And she said one thing. Only one. Paid twice now, Mr. Crane. She did not raise her voice. The second time, honestly. That was all. No more words. She held out her hand for the due, and he paid it before the 40 merchants and the board and the Admiralty man and every waterman on the Reach, and he took his ticket, and he turned, and he went down off the landing an ordinary man, and the river he had strangled ran free behind him. 1 year on. Michaelmas again, and a grey-gold morning coming up over the Reach, and Marsh End Wharf busy at the dawn. Retimbered now, the shed sound, the landing firm, new piles driven where the old ones had rotted. Lighters at the wharf and small boats on the water, and a cart or two on the low road, and the tide coming up the 4 miles past the Saltney Bar and the old sea mark as it had come for 10,000 years. Only now every keel that touched the shore paid its fare and public due, and no man was the poorer for it, and the river was the richer. Inside the office, where a tin box had once lain under a warped board, the great ledger lay open on the desk, and above it, on a bright nail, hung the brass seal, polished now, catching the morning light, and above that, fresh painted over the door, the old name restored. Fenwick, Marsh End Wharf. Established and lawful and clean. Tobias Merritt kept the tally. Mended, mostly, though his hands still shook a little on a cold morning. He sat at the desk in the mornings and marked the keels as they came, and every mark he made now was a due paid and entered, not a due owed and forgotten. And the old wall with its 90 years of unpaid tallies had been left just as it was, on purpose, not scrubbed away, so that a body could stand and look at it and understand what neglect had cost, and what one red paper had put right. Daniel Reeve worked the reach as her partner. His lighter and 3 more besides, honest water work in a river no longer strangled, and if there was more between them than lighters and ledgers, more that had grown quiet and steady from the night she came down a ladder with a poker in her hand, well, that was their own affair, and the reach wished them well, and no man begrudged it, for she had taken nothing from anyone to have it. She had only been steady, and he had loved her for it before ever he knew she'd been gentry. Which is the truest way of all to be loved. She had set the dues low, and kept them public, nailed to the gate for any man to read, the same for the poor keel as the rich, so that no waterman would ever again be bled the way Crane had bled them, and the way her own father had been broken by a hard man's hold on an honest trade. That was the whole of what she wanted. Not to rule the river, only to see it dealt with square. She stood at the wharf gate that Michaelmas morning with the charter, framed now behind glass, hung sound upon the post, and she watched the tide come up gold over the flats, and the boats come in, and she thought of her father, and she was not ashamed. His name was clean. The debt was paid, to the penny and beyond, and the very paper that saved her had been sitting all along in a rotting office that the whole river called, condemned, waiting 90 years for someone to trouble to read it. For the river never stopped owing what was right. It only wanted somebody the proud had forgotten to look at, a ruined girl with £30 and a good name, to pick up an old paper and read it aloud, and nail the truth to a gate. If you've ever been counted out by someone who should have looked closer, tell me the name of your own town below, and let this story find the next person who needs to hear it.